Archive 13, Granny Ripper's Silent Killings, The Case of Tamara Samsonova. Introduction. A bathtub in a St. Petersburg apartment block held 3 inches of pink water. The drain coughed once. Tamara Samsonova stood at the sink, scrubbing her hands with a bar of laundry soap until the skin around her knuckles split. She dried them on a towel that already carried brown stains from the night before. The neighbor's dentures sat on the windowsill. Samsonova picked them up, examined the bite marks on the plastic, then dropped them into a plastic bag with the rest of the things she intended to keep. She had lived in the same 2-room flat for 30 years. The walls were covered in floral paper that had peeled at the corners. In the corner, by the stove, she kept a stack of old Soviet newspapers, their headlines faded to the color of weak tea. She used the pages to wrap the pieces she did not want to leave in the shared hallway. The smell of the pieces was not strong yet, but it would be by morning. She opened the window anyway. Cold Neva air moved across the table where a single plate waited with bread and a piece of sausage. The neighbor had knocked at 7 the previous evening. He complained about the television volume. Samsonova invited him in for tea. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. Then it stopped. She remembered the sound his head made against the edge of the cast iron radiator. After that, the work began. She moved slowly because her back hurt. She used the same knives she used for cooking. The building's thin walls carried every sound to the apartments above and below, yet no one came to the door. No one ever came to the door. By 3 in the morning, she had finished the first stage. She placed the larger sections into black plastic bags and carried them down the stairs one at a time. The lift was broken again. On the 3rd trip, she met the night watchman in the stairwell. He nodded. She nodded back. He continued upward. Samsonova continued downward to the courtyard bins. She returned to her flat, washed the floor twice with bleach, and sat on the edge of the bed until the sky lightened over the Neva. She had done this before. The first killing left her hands shaking for days. The second left her calm. The third produced only the ordinary fatigue of any long task. She told herself the neighbors would not be missed. They were old. They lived alone. Their names appeared on no one's list except the building registry. The archives record that Samsonova kept a notebook. In it, she wrote the dates and the names. She also wrote the amounts of money she found in their flats. The notebook remained on the kitchen table, beside the plate of bread and sausage. It was not hidden. It was never hidden. That was perhaps the most disturbing fact of all. This is Archive 13. Every file in this archive is real. Every name was a person. What you are about to hear is not a story. It is a record. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments what single detail in the notebook finally forced investigators to treat the deaths as connected rather than natural causes. St. Petersburg in July smells like canal water and diesel and old stone baking in weak northern sun. The courtyards of the Frunzensky district smell like something else entirely. Rotting wood, decades of cooking fat worked into Soviet-era plaster. The particular sweetness of garbage left one day too long in summer heat. It was that sweetness that first made a passerby pause near the courtyard bins on Dimitrova Street in late July 2015. The bags were black, knotted at the top. There were several of them, arranged with a tidiness that struck witnesses as unusual for refuse disposal. One had split at the seam. What protruded from the split was the kind of thing that, once seen, cannot be unseen. The passerby, a woman in her 60s returning from a morning market run, set down her string bag of onions and did not pick it up again for a very long time. Police units arrived within the hour. What they found in the courtyard bags, and subsequently in the apartment on the 4th floor, constituted one of the most methodical crime scenes St. Petersburg homicide investigators had encountered in a decade. The flat itself was clean, aggressively, almost theatrically clean. The floors smelled of bleach so strong it made the first officer through the door blink back tears. The bathtub had been scrubbed. The kitchen knives had been washed and replaced in their wooden block in size order. On the kitchen table, a plate with bread and sausage, half eaten, a glass of weak tea, still warm, and a notebook, spiral-bound, its cardboard cover decorated with a pattern of small blue flowers. The notebook was open to the most recent entry. The entry was dated 2 days prior. It contained a name, a date, and a number. Investigators initially assumed the number was an apartment reference. It was not. It was a monetary amount. the sum found in the victim's wallet, recorded with the precision of a household ledger. The victim identified from the courtyard remains was Sergei Pozdayev, 79 years old, a retired electrical engineer who had lived on the 5th floor of the same building for 22 years. He had no immediate family in the city. His pension was deposited automatically. His mail accumulated. By the time neighbors noticed his absence, the absence had already been explained away by the assumption that old people sometimes simply withdraw from the world. They become quiet. They stop answering the door. Eventually, they stop existing, and no one is surprised. He had complained once to the building management office about the volume of the television in the flat below his. He had been told that nothing could be done. He had gone home and knocked on the door of the apartment directly below. She had invited him in for tea. According to the Russian Investigative Committee's 2015 official statement, the remains found in Dimitrova Street corresponded to at least one confirmed victim. Physical evidence collected from the 4th floor flat connected Tamara Samsonova, age 68, to the scene within 48 hours of the initial discovery. Dr. Yuri Antonov, a forensic behavioral consultant who reviewed the case materials for St. Petersburg State University's Criminology Department, later noted, the organization of the crime scene was not frenzied, it was domestic. That is the word I kept returning to, domestic. As though the act itself had been absorbed into the routine of her household management. Domestic. The word sits in the mouth like something cold. Myth versus reality. The popular press immediately reached for the word monster. Readers wanted a monster. Monsters are comprehensible. They exist outside the ordinary world. The reality documented in the case files is more troubling. Tamara Samsonova did not look like a monster. She looked like someone's grandmother. She dressed carefully. She carried a shopping bag. She exchanged pleasantries with the building's other residents. She had been their neighbor for 30 years. She had been there all along. The bath held 3 inches of pink water. The drain coughed once. And the city moved through its July morning entirely unaware that the woman in the 4th floor flat had just begun to be known to the world. There is a particular kind of silence that falls in a room after investigators realize what they are holding. Not the silence of shock, the silence of recalibration, of every assumption in the room quietly rearranging itself. That silence fell in the Frenzensky District Police Station on the morning of July 29, 2015, when a detective named in court records only as Senior Investigator V. Morozov turned the pages of Tamara Samsonova's notebook past the most recent entry and found that it was not the first. It was not the second either. The notebook was 47 pages long. Not all pages contained entries, but enough did. The entries were written in 2 different inks, sometimes pencil, occasionally ballpoint over pencil, as though the writer had gone back to reinforce the lines. The handwriting was neat, slightly old-fashioned in its Cyrillic letter forms, the kind of penmanship taught in Soviet-era schoolrooms where a crooked letter earned a ruler across the knuckles. Each entry followed the same structure, a date, a name, or in several cases an initial followed by a patronymic, a physical description that investigators characterized in court documents as clinical in its detachment, and then a number. The numbers varied. Most were small. The largest recorded was 11,000 rubles. Russian forensic document analysts confirmed during the 2017 trial proceedings that the notebook entries spanned a period of at least 11 years. The earliest dated entry was from 2003. The ink oxidation patterns were consistent with this timeline. This was not a recent aberration. This was a practice. Senior investigator Morozov, according to court testimony, initially flagged the notebook as potential evidence in a financial crime. It was a homicide specialist called in the following morning who recognized what the entries actually documented. I read the 3rd entry twice, the specialist stated in trial testimony. Then I read it a 3rd time. The level of detail was not the detail of a diary. It was the detail of an account book. She was recording what she had taken, and she was recording what she had done to take it. What the notebook revealed about Samsonova's psychology is worth examining carefully, because it cuts against the narratives that courts and media tend to construct around crimes of this nature. She was not confessing. The notebook was not a confession. It contained no expressions of remorse, no theological language, no justification. It was documentation. The same impulse that led her to record the amounts of money found in her victims' flats led her to record the acts themselves. She was in some functional sense, keeping accounts. Dr. Natalia Bogdanova, a psychiatric consultant cited in the Moscow Institute of Psychiatry's 2014 evaluation report, prepared during an earlier, separate legal proceeding involving Samsonova, wrote, "The subject demonstrates a highly organized cognitive framework for categorizing interpersonal relationships in transactional terms. Relationships have value, while the transactional exchange is active. When the exchange concludes or fails to meet expectation, the subject recategorizes the relationship entirely." Recategorizes. It is a word from a psychology paper. Translated into the language of that kitchen table, it means something else. Pause. Myth versus reality. Investigators initially theorized that the notebook had been left in plain view because Samsonova had not expected to be caught quickly enough for it to matter. Subsequent psychological assessment challenged this interpretation. The more troubling possibility, and the one that several forensic psychiatrists endorsed in trial documentation, is that the notebook was left in plain view because Samsonova saw no reason to conceal it. The entries recorded facts. The facts were hers. The notebook belonged on her kitchen table in the same way the plate and the glass of tea belonged there. She had not hidden the notebook. She had not hidden anything. The building's other residents, interviewed by investigators in the days following the arrest, described Samsonova consistently and in terms that began to feel, as the interviews accumulated, like a kind of verdict in themselves. Quiet, kept to herself, always nodded in the stairwell, sometimes brought food to the older residents when they were unwell. That last detail appears in 3 separate interview transcripts. She brought food to the older residents when they were unwell. The building trusted her with its most vulnerable people. His name was Sergei Dmitrievich Volkov, 74 years old, a former lathe operator at the Kirov plant who had retired in 1998 and spent his remaining years in the same third-floor flat where he had raised 2 children who now lived in Chelyabinsk and Yekaterinburg and called on holidays if they remembered. He kept a small television on a shelf above the radiator. He watched it in the evenings with the volume raised because his hearing had deteriorated after decades on the factory floor. He liked news programs and nature documentaries. He disliked intensely the sound of footsteps from the flat above at hours when decent people were sleeping. He had made a complaint to the building management twice. Neither complaint produced a result. The third time, in the autumn of 2011, he decided to address the problem directly. He climbed 1 flight of stairs and knocked on the door of the flat above. The woman who answered was polite. She expressed surprise at the disturbance she had caused. She offered tea. Sergei Dmitrievich Volkov accepted. What happened next is reconstructed from the forensic evidence reviewed during the 2017 trial, cross-referenced against entries in Samsonova's notebook and against testimony from other building residents who interacted with Volkov in the days before his disappearance. His name appears in the notebook with a date in October 2011. The physical description in the entry matches Volkov's build and age. The amount recorded alongside his name corresponds to money witnesses confirmed he kept in an envelope taped to the back of his kitchen clock. The entry for Volkov is the 4th in the notebook. It is not written with any different hand pressure than the entries before it. There is no hesitation visible in the penmanship, no crossouts. She wrote his name and continued to the next line. Volkov's disappearance in 2011 was not immediately investigated as suspicious. He had no formal care arrangement. His children in Chelyabinsk and Yekaterinburg assumed he had stopped calling because he was stubborn. The building management noted his rent continued to be paid from his pension account for several months after his last confirmed sighting. By the time the account ran dry and the flat was formally inspected, any forensic evidence had long since been cleaned away, ventilated, bleached into absence. The inspecting officer noted in his report that the flat showed no signs of disturbance. It was, he wrote, a clean and orderly dwelling, consistent with an elderly person living alone. He was looking at the wrong flat. According to the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs' 2016 Cold Case Review Bulletin, Volkov's case was one of at least 3 deaths or disappearances in the Frunzensky district between 2003 and 2015 that were retroactively reclassified following Samsonova's arrest. In each case, the initial classification had been either natural causes or voluntary relocation, a bureaucratic category used when elderly residents disappear without formal next-of-kin notification. The bulletin noted, with a restraint that reads now as something close to institutional shame, that the reclassification process was complicated by the absence of remains. The absence of remains was not accidental. Dr. Alexei Grishkov, a forensic behavioral scientist at St. Petersburg State University, whose analysis was submitted to the court in 2017, described the pattern with characteristic precision. The subject selected victims who existed at the margins of social verification. They had reduced family contact, limited institutional monitoring, no daily accountability structure. The selection was not random. It reflected sustained environmental observation over years. She knew who would not be missed immediately. She knew who would not be missed at all. She had lived in that building for 30 years. She had watched it breathe. She had watched its residents age and withdraw and become, one by one, alone. She understood the building's rhythms the way a farmer understands weather. Something would shift in the light. A door would stop opening. A television would go quiet. And she would know. Myth versus reality. Media coverage in 2015 frequently described Samsonova as a predator who targeted the elderly as a matter of opportunity and convenience. The psychological record suggests the reality is more considered and therefore more disturbing. Opportunity was a component, but opportunity was manufactured. Relationships were cultivated over months and sometimes years before they reached their terminal point. She brought food when neighbors were unwell. She offered tea. She listened to the complaints about the building management that no one else wanted to hear. She was useful. She made herself useful deliberately, methodically, in the way that a person makes themselves useful when they understand that usefulness is its own form of access. She had been building these relationships the way a fisherman builds a trap. Sergei Dmitrievich Volkov climbed one flight of stairs to complain about the noise. He sat at her kitchen table and drank tea from a cup she had placed in front of him. The television was on in the corner, volume lowered now, casting blue light across the floral wallpaper. Outside, the autumn pressed against the windows. The Neva moved its dark water toward the Gulf. The building settled around them with its usual creaks. He never came home to his third-floor flat again. His children called at Christmas and assumed, when no one answered, that he had simply stopped picking up the telephone. The notebook entry for October 2011 is written in blue ballpoint. The letters are even. The pressure is consistent from first stroke to last. Below his name, below the monetary amount, there is a single additional notation. Investigators at trial could not agree on whether it was a word or an abbreviation. The court record describes it as a personal symbol of unknown significance. She never explained it. She was never asked about it directly. Some files stay partially closed. That is the nature of this archive. The residents of the building on Dimitrova Street learned to identify Samsonova by smell before they saw her, not because she smelled unpleasant, because she smelled of cleaning, of bleach and laundry soap, and the particular chemical sharpness of Soviet-era floor wax applied in quantities that suggested either extreme fastidiousness or something it was easier not to name. Other residents cleaned their flats. Samsonova cleaned the shared spaces, unprompted, without being asked. She would appear in the stairwell on a weekend morning with a mop and a bucket and work her way methodically from the top landing to the ground floor entrance. Building residents recalled this habit going back 15 years or more. They regarded it as eccentricity, a lonely woman filling her time, something between charitable and compulsive. The stairwell, investigators would later confirm, was also a transit route. Forensic analysis of the stairwell, conducted following Samsonova's arrest in July 2015, detected trace biological material on the undersides of the third and fourth floor banisters, in the gap between the skirting board and the floor on the third floor landing, and in the mortar joints of the ground floor entrance step. The material had been subjected to repeated chemical cleaning. Sufficient trace remained for typing. The types were consistent with victims identified in the notebook. She had cleaned the stairwell after each transit. Then she had cleaned it again in the ordinary course of her maintenance routine, providing additional chemical cover at intervals over months and years. The stairwell had been cleaned so many times and with such consistency that the forensic team described the evidence recovery as, in their technical language, significantly compromised. She had been maintaining the crime scene for years. The night watchman. His name was Arkady Semyonovich Petrov, 61 years old, employed by the building management company for 11 years. He appears in 3 different sections of this case. He is not a suspect. He is something more uncomfortable than a suspect. He is a witness who witnessed nothing, or understood nothing of what he witnessed, or chose the interpretation that allowed him to continue nodding in stairwells and completing his shift log and going home in the morning without the weight of knowing. He passed her on the stairs on multiple occasions. She was carrying bags. She was going down to the bins. It was late. These facts were available to him. They assembled into nothing. She was a quiet woman, he told investigators. She kept to herself. She looked after the stairwell. Dr. Yuri Antonov, in his behavioral analysis submitted to the court, addressed the phenomenon of what he termed environmental normalization in communal living spaces. When a behavior is repeated consistently over years within a closed community, it acquires the quality of normalcy regardless of its actual nature. The residents of this building had been trained, by years of consistent experience, to regard this woman's late-night cleaning activity as unremarkable. She had invested years in making herself unremarkable. Unremarkable. The word is doing considerable work in that sentence. The building itself was complicit, not through malice, but through the ordinary human preference for not knowing what we do not have to know. The Soviet-era apartment block, and this one was built in 1963, a 5-story Khrushchev-era prefab with thin walls and a lift that broke every winter, is a particular kind of social architecture. It places people in intimate proximity while simultaneously training them in the discipline of not noticing. You hear the television through the ceiling. You hear the argument through the wall. You hear the 3 a.m. movement on the stairs. And you pull the blanket up and explain it to yourself in the most comfortable terms available and go back to sleep. That architecture served Tamara Samsonova for more than a decade. The building that housed her crimes also concealed them. Her name was Valentina Fyodorovna Ivanova. She was 66 years old. She had worked for 31 years as a bookkeeper at a textile factory in the Nevsky district, surviving 3 rounds of post-Soviet privatization that eliminated her colleagues one by one until only she remained, keeping the accounts of an enterprise that no longer manufactured anything, until the enterprise itself finally stopped existing in 2009. After that, she lived on her pension and the small amount she made from selling homemade preserves at the weekend market near Vitebsky Station. She made excellent pickled mushrooms. Several of the building's residents confirmed this. She gave jars away at New Year. She kept the recipe, handwritten, folded inside a small address book she carried in the left pocket of her winter coat. She had no children. Her husband had died in 1997. She had one friend, a woman named Galina who lived in Pushkin and who, in the weeks following Valentina's disappearance, assumed that Valentina had finally decided to visit a sister in Pskov she had been talking about visiting for years. Valentina Ivanova appears in Samsonova's notebook. Her entry is dated March 2014. It is the 6th recorded entry. The physical description is accurate. The monetary amount listed, 4,200 rubles, corresponds to what Galina later told investigators Valentina typically kept in the envelope she stored behind the loose tile in her bathroom. The address book was not recovered. The mushroom recipe was not recovered. What was recovered, in the lining of a coat found bundled in a black plastic bag in Samsonova's storage space in the building's basement, was a folded square of paper. The handwriting on it matched Valentina Ivanova's. Forensic document analysts confirmed the ink was consistent with the period. The coat had been folded around the paper as though the paper mattered. Whether Samsonova kept the coat and the paper deliberately, and what that deliberate keeping means, these are questions the trial record does not answer directly. The court noted the item as physical evidence linking the accused to the victim. The psychological implications were assessed briefly in expert testimony, and then, in the way that courtrooms tend to handle things that cannot be contained within legal categories, set aside. Dr. Natalia Bogdanova's assessment in the Moscow Institute of Psychiatry's evaluation addressed what she called the subject's preservation behavior. The retention of personal items belonging to victims is documented in a subset of serial homicide cases and is generally interpreted as serving one of 2 psychological functions: trophy maintenance, indicating a desire to revisit and relive the act, or a more complex archival function in which the subject is constructing a private record of relationships that had meaning to them in ways distinct from the public record. She remembered Valentina Ivanova. In her own way and through her own pathology, she remembered. Among the items recovered from Samsonova's flat and storage space during the post-arrest search were 17 individual personal items traceable to other individuals. Not all of these individuals could be identified during the investigation period. 3 were matched to confirmed victims. The remaining 14 items, including a man's watch, a small icon, 2 photograph albums, and a child's school medal, were cataloged and retained as potential evidence in cases that remain open. Myth versus reality. The press constructed a narrative of pure predation, Samsonova as a shark moving through the building's waters. The evidence suggests something more psychologically layered. The items in the basement were not hidden with the same care that the crime scenes were cleaned. They were stored, preserved. A woman who murdered for money and then kept the victim's personal effects alongside their monetary records was maintaining something more complex than a simple predatory practice. She was, in some sense, that forensic psychiatry has not fully resolved, maintaining a community, her own version of the one she had dismantled. She had kept them all. In her own way, she had kept every one of them. Valentina Ivanova's address book was never found. Somewhere in its pages were names and telephone numbers, small records of a life connected to other lives. Galina in Pushkin, the woman in Pskov who was expecting a visit, the baker near Vitebsky station who knew her preference for the darker bread. All of them waited. Gradually, they stopped waiting and started assuming. The assumption was always the comfortable one. The telephone on Valentina's kitchen wall did not ring again after March 2014. In the winter of 2012, a man named Pavel Alexeyevich Rakov stopped appearing at the communal water tap on the second-floor landing. This was noticed. It was mentioned between 2 residents in passing, in the way that building residents mention the small absences that accumulate in old Soviet blocks where the infrastructure has never been fully modernized and the pipes still sometimes require manual operation. It was mentioned, and then it was absorbed into the texture of daily life without producing any formal action. Pavel Rakov was 71 years old. He had worked as a draftsman for the city planning department for 26 years. He had a daughter named Irina who lived in Novgorod and who, when investigators finally contacted her in 2015, said that she had assumed her father had moved to a smaller city where costs were lower. He had talked about it for years. He had never done it. But the gap between what Pavel Rakov talked about and what he actually did was wide enough that Irina had simply extended the benefit of the doubt across an absence that lasted. By the time she was contacted, 3 years. 3 years. 3 years. His name is in the notebook. The entry is dated January 2012. It is the 5th recorded entry. The monetary amount, 6,000 rubles, is listed with the same neat handwriting as every other entry. Below it, as with several other entries, there is a secondary notation. In Pavel Rakov's case, the notation reads as an abbreviation of a word that forensic linguists at the 2017 trial tentatively identified as the Russian word for difficult. The work had been difficult with Pavel Rakov. She had recorded this. She had filed it in her accounts the way a tradesperson notes a job that required extra effort for the purpose of future reference. The second disappearance, the one no one reported, is in many ways the hinge of this case, not because of what it reveals about Samsonova, whose pattern by this point had a terrible internal consistency, but because of what it reveals about the systems that surrounded her. The building management company had a registry. The city pension administration had a file. The city planning department's personnel records contained Pavel Rakov's name and service dates and an emergency contact number for Irina in Novgorod. None of these institutions spoke to the others. None of them was designed to notice a gap. Fact, the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs 2016 cold case review identified this systemic failure as a contributing environmental factor in the Samsonova case. The review noted that the demographic profile of victims, elderly, living alone, with reduced family contact, in urban communal housing, corresponded precisely to the population segment least likely to generate a timely missing persons report. The average time between last confirmed sighting and formal report in this demographic was, according to the review's statistical analysis, 14 months. 14 months. In 14 months, a crime scene can be cleaned, ventilated, repainted, and re-inhabited. Evidence disperses, memory softens, the uncomfortable question fades into the administratively manageable answer. Dr. Alexei Grishkov's behavioral analysis addressed the second disappearance specifically. The absence of a report following the Rakov case represents a critical juncture. In serial homicide cases, a report at this stage, a missing persons investigation, even a cursory welfare check, frequently introduces disruption sufficient to alter the subject's behavior or accelerate exposure. The absence of a report removes that disruption. The subject receives, in effect, an environmental confirmation that the practice is sustainable. The second victim is often the most consequential in the longitudinal arc of a serial case, not because of who they are, but because of what their absence does to the perpetrator's risk calculus. The risk calculus changed in January 2012. The building absorbed the change without flinching. Irina Rakova, Pavel's daughter in Novgorod, gave a statement to investigators in August 2015. The statement is included in the court record and runs to 11 pages. Much of it is the articulation of retrospective guilt, the particular anguish of a person reconstructing in light of what they now know, each decision they made that seemed reasonable at the time, and looks, from the far side of knowing, like abandonment. She had not visited in 18 months before his disappearance. She had called irregularly. She had told herself that her father was independent, that he did not want to be managed, that space was a form of respect. These things were probably all true. They were also, simultaneously, the precise conditions under which Tamara Samsonova operated. Myth versus reality. The narrative of family negligence, the suggestion that Pavel Rakov disappeared because his family failed him, was present in some early media coverage and was firmly rejected by investigators and the court. The systemic failure was institutional, not personal. Individual families making individual decisions in good faith cannot compensate for a reporting infrastructure that is not designed to detect the slow disappearance of isolated elderly citizens. The guilt Irina carried was real. The responsibility was not hers alone to carry. It belonged to the building registry that did not cross-reference, to the pension administration that continued paying into an empty flat, to the neighbor in the stairwell who nodded and continued upward, to the city that had built its old people into the walls of these blocks and then quietly forgotten they were there. Pavel Rakov did not disappear. He was disappeared. There is a difference. His daughter kept his drafting pencils. She had taken them years before, during one of her last visits, thinking he might not need them anymore. They were in a tin on her desk in Novgorod when investigators called. She was using one to write a grocery list when the phone rang. She put the pencil down. She did not pick it up again for a long time. Some objects become unbearable through no fault of their own. The notebook entry for January 2012 sits in the middle of the page. The word below Pavel Rakov's name, difficult, is underlined once. She was brought in on July 30th, 2015. She arrived at the Frunzensky District Police Station carrying a string bag with a change of clothes, a toothbrush in a plastic case, and a paperback novel. She had packed the bag herself before officers arrived to collect her. She had locked her flat and checked that the gas was off. The first interview lasted 3 hours. Investigators described her demeanor as cooperative. That word appears in the interview transcript 4 times. Cooperative. She answered questions directly. She did not request legal representation immediately, which under Russian criminal procedure she was entitled to do. She accepted the glass of water offered to her. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her. She was 68 years old. She wore a gray cardigan over a dark dress. She had combed her hair. What she said in that first interview is a matter of court record and has been reported extensively. She confirmed her residence. She confirmed she had been in the building on the relevant dates. She confirmed that she knew the victims by name. She confirmed the notebook was hers. She described its contents as personal records. When asked what she meant by personal records, she paused for what the transcript marks as approximately 8 seconds. Then she said, "I kept track of things. I always kept track of things." That pause, 8 seconds, in a police interview, 8 seconds is a long time. The transcript of the July 30 interview, filed with the St. Petersburg City Court for the 2017 proceedings, records that Samsonova made no attempt to deny ownership of the notebook or to provide an alternative explanation for its contents. She did not claim the entries referred to something other than what they appeared to refer to. What she declined to discuss, with a consistency that investigators found remarkable, was motive. Every question that touched on the question of why was met with a variation of the same response. "I don't think about it that way." Dr. Natalia Bogdanova, reviewing the interview transcript for her psychiatric assessment, noted, The subject's refusal to engage with motivational framing is not evasion in the conventional sense. It appears to reflect a genuine cognitive architecture in which the question of why does not have operational meaning for her. She did these things in the same way that she cleaned the stairwell, because the situation presented itself, because the action followed logically from the circumstances. The concept of a reason, separate from the act itself, does not appear to be present. Senior investigator Morozov, whose testimony at the 2017 trial was among the most detailed in the record, described the moment midway through the second interview session, conducted the following morning, when the shape of the case became clear to him. He had returned to the question of the notebook's earlier entries. He had placed the notebook open on the table between them, turned to an entry from 2007. He asked her to explain it. She looked at the entry. She looked at him. She said, "That was Misha. He had a bad cough all that winter." Misha, a diminutive, the diminutive you use for someone you know. Morozov said he excused himself for a few minutes at that point. He went to the corridor and stood there for a moment. Then he went back in and continued. Myth versus reality. Media coverage of the interviews tended to focus on Samsonova's apparent calm as evidence of psychopathy, the absence of remorse read as the absence of any recognizable inner life. The psychiatric assessment produced a more complex picture. Samsonova was not without emotional response. She showed visible distress when asked about her late husband. She expressed what the assessing psychiatrist described as genuine concern about the welfare of the building's other elderly residents following her arrest. She worried, apparently sincerely, about who would clean the stairwell. The absence was not of feeling. The absence was of the specific architecture of conscience that connects an action to its harm to another person. Somewhere in the formation of Tamara Samsonova, that particular connection had not been built. She worried about the stairwell. She did not worry about the people. The second interview ended at noon on July 31. Samsonova was formally charged later that afternoon. She was processed, photographed, and placed in pre-trial detention. On her way out of the interview room, according to a detail recorded by an officer present, she paused at the door and asked whether someone would water the plants on her kitchen windowsill. She had 3 small plants. She was concerned about the one nearest the radiator, which tended to dry out. No one answered her. She had kept a record of everything except the thing that mattered most. The search of Samsonova's flat, conducted on August 1, 2015, took 11 hours. It was carried out by a team of 7, including 2 forensic technicians and a specialist in document recovery. They worked methodically from the entrance hall inward, cataloging as they went. The flat was 2 rooms. It was immaculate. Under the bed, in a cardboard box of the kind used to store winter boots, they found 16 VHS cassette tapes. This was not, in itself, unusual. Many residents of Samsonova's generation still kept VHS recordings, films, television programs recorded off the air in the 80s and 90s. The tapes were labeled in the same handwriting as the notebook. The labels were dated. The earliest was from 1999. The forensic technicians bagged and tagged them. The tapes were taken to a facility equipped to play them. The contents of the tapes are partially described in the court record and partially sealed. What can be confirmed from public trial documentation is the following. The tapes contained recorded footage of the interior of Samsonova's flat. The footage was stationary, shot from a fixed position near the kitchen door, covering most of the main room. The recordings were not continuous. They were episodic, ranging in length from a few minutes to several hours. On several tapes, other individuals are visible. In some instances, these individuals can be identified. Their presence in the flat corresponds to dates recorded in the notebook. The tapes were not, in the legal characterization used at trial, recordings of the acts themselves. What they recorded was the before, the ordinary domestic moment that preceded what the notebook recorded. A person sitting at her kitchen table, 2 cups, the television providing blue light in the corner, conversation. The mundane social transaction that was the gateway to everything that followed. Forensic video analysts confirmed at trial that the recording equipment visible in certain frames was a domestic video camera mounted on a shelf among other household objects. The positioning was consistent with deliberate concealment within an otherwise ordinary domestic arrangement. The camera had been there for years. Residents who had visited the flat The building's other residents, the people who had accepted her hospitality, had not noticed it. Dr. Alexei Grishkov's testimony at this point became the most quoted passage of the entire trial. What the tapes tell us is not what the prosecution argued they tell us, which is premeditation in the narrow legal sense. What they tell us, if we are willing to look at them honestly, is that she wanted to remember. She wanted to have a record of the relationship before it ended. The camera was not a weapon. It was, in its own pathological logic, an act of preservation. She was archiving her own life. Archiving her own life. There is something that sits at the intersection of the notebook and the tapes that the trial record does not fully address, and that this archive must. The two together, the written accounts of what was taken and what was done, and the visual record of the moments before, constitute something that forensic psychiatrists have not agreed on a single term for. Some called it a trophy archive, some called it a memorial system. One assessment used the phrase substitute intimacy, the idea that a woman who was, by every account, profoundly isolated, had found a way to maintain the presence of people whose presence she had permanently eliminated. She watched the tapes. There is no direct evidence for this, but the absence of dust on the VHS player and the wear pattern on the cassette mechanisms, noted in the forensic technician's report, suggests the machine was used regularly. She sat in her flat in the evenings and she watched. The tapes generated significant media speculation about their content that went considerably beyond what the trial record supports. Several outlets implied that the recordings documented the acts themselves. The court record does not support this. The sealed portions of the tapes remain sealed, and their existence fuels ongoing speculation. But investigators and the court drew a clear line between what was confirmed and what was speculated. This archive will not cross that line. What the confirmed tapes show is ordinary. Two people at a kitchen table, tea, conversation, the sound of the television, the blue light, the moment before. The moment before is always the most terrible part. The VHS player was cataloged as evidence and removed from the flat. The box beneath the bed was empty without the tapes. Forensic technicians photographed it anyway. In their photographs, it looks like any box, the kind of thing anyone might keep, the kind of thing that holds ordinary objects. 16 tapes, 11 years. She had been watching them all along. Loud. This is the chapter that the Russian judicial system would prefer to be shorter. It will not be shorter, because the events documented here represent the clearest and most consequential institutional failure in the entire Samsonova case, and institutional failures of this kind do not stay in Russia. They travel, they repeat, they appear in different cities, different bureaucratic languages, different institutional colors, but the same fundamental shape: a warning issued, a warning filed, the filing substituting for the action the warning required. The Moscow Institute of Psychiatry's 2014 evaluation report is 43 pages long. Its conclusions are not ambiguous. To understand why that report existed, we must go back to 2013. In that year, Tamara Samsonova came to the attention of the local health administration in the Frunzensky district, not in connection with any criminal investigation, but in connection with a complaint filed by the building's management company regarding what the company described as erratic behavior. The specific incidents cited in the management company's complaint are minor, viewed in isolation: a dispute over the cleaning schedule, an accusation made against another resident that witnesses described as disproportionate and perseverative, a word the building management clerk apparently looked up specifically to describe the way Samsonova returned to the same grievance over weeks, using the same words in the same order, without variation or diminution. A letter written to the district council that was 3 pages long and concerned the angle of the courtyard bins. These things, viewed individually, are the behaviors of a difficult eccentric. The management company complaint triggered a routine welfare assessment. The welfare assessment produced a referral. The referral reached the Moscow Institute of Psychiatry through the standard federal channel. Dr. Natalia Bogdanova, the psychiatrist assigned to evaluate Samsonova in early 2014, conducted 4 assessment sessions over 6 weeks. Her report, submitted in April 2014, is a document that reads, in retrospect, with an almost unbearable clarity. The clinical language is precise and measured, as clinical language always is, but beneath the precision, the meaning is not difficult to locate. The relevant conclusions, translated from the court's documentary record, read as follows. The subject demonstrates a personality organization consistent with a severe disorder of the schizotypal type, with secondary features of paranoid ideation and a documented history of dissociative episodes. The subject shows a significantly impaired capacity for empathic resonance, that is, for the cognitive and emotional recognition of others as subjects with independent inner lives of equivalent value to her own. The subject describes relationships in transactional terms exclusively. The subject has a history of unresolved interpersonal conflict with neighbors and co-residents that escalates in a pattern the subject does not appear to recognize or regulate. The subject lives alone in close residential proximity to a population of isolated elderly individuals. The report then contained a recommendation. The recommendation called for structured ongoing psychiatric monitoring at intervals of no less than 3 months to be conducted by the District Mental Health Service. It noted that the subject's living situation created a specific risk environment that warranted active case management rather than passive review. It used, in its final summary paragraph, a phrase that investigators and journalists have returned to repeatedly since the 2017 trial. The phrase was, "Elevated risk of harm to others within the subject's immediate residential environment." Elevated risk of harm to others within the subject's immediate residential environment. Fact: the 2014 report was received by the District Mental Health Service on April 17, 2014. It was logged. It was assigned a case number. The case number was entered in the district registry under the standard category for personality disorder with monitoring recommendation. A follow-up appointment was scheduled for July 2014. Tamara Samsonova did not attend the July appointment. A letter was sent to her address. There is no record in the District Health Service files of any further action taken following the non-attendance. Between April 2014 and July 2015, Valentina Fyodorovna Ivanova disappeared. The remains in the courtyard bags were discovered. Sergei Pozdayev was killed. The monitoring recommendation was active during both events. It had simply produced no monitoring. Dr. Bogdanova was called as a witness at the 2017 trial. Her testimony is among the most carefully worded in the record. She confirmed the report. She confirmed the recommendation. She was asked whether, in her professional assessment, the implementation of the monitoring protocol recommended in her 2014 report could have prevented subsequent events. She paused. Then she said, "I cannot say with certainty that it would have prevented harm. I can say with certainty that it was designed to detect the conditions under which harm was likely. The detection did not occur. The conditions were present." The conditions were present. 4 words that carry the weight of every life the monitoring system did not protect. VHEVSER theory versus reality. The trial's handling of the psychiatric evidence was criticized by legal observers and human rights monitors. The defense argued that the 2014 report established diminished responsibility. The prosecution argued that the report's non-implementation was irrelevant to the charges. Neither argument addressed what Dr. Bogdanova's testimony had quietly placed in the record, that the state had been warned, in writing, in clinical detail, by a qualified professional 14 months before the final victim was killed, and that the warning had been filed and forgotten with the efficiency of a bureaucracy that is very good at paperwork and very bad at people. Human Rights Watch's 2016 country report on Russian forensic psychiatric facilities noted the Samsonova case as an example of systemic gaps in community psychiatric monitoring for individuals identified as high risk but not yet subject to involuntary detention orders. The report noted that these gaps were not specific to Russia. They appear wherever mental health systems are built around crisis response rather than preventive management. The warning existed. The file existed. The system that should have connected them did not exist. Valentina Ivanova made her pickled mushrooms in the autumn. She gave them away at New Year. She was alive when Dr. Bogdanova submitted her report. She was alive when the follow-up appointment was scheduled. She was alive when the letter was sent to Samsonova's address and no further action was taken. She was alive through all of it. Then she wasn't. Dr. Bogdanova, asked at the trial's conclusion whether she wished to add anything to her testimony, said only this: "I wrote the recommendation because I believed it was necessary. I still believe it was necessary. I am here because it was not followed. I do not know what else to say." She stepped down from the witness stand. The courtroom was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that means everyone in the room has just understood the same thing at the same time, and no one wants to be the first to move. Then the session continued. All the other entries in Samsonova's notebook were written in ink, blue ballpoint, occasionally black. The entries were permanent. They were statements of record. The ink committed them to the page, the way a financial ledger commits a transaction. Final, settled, filed. The entry toward the back of the notebook, near the last used pages, was written in pencil. Investigators noticed the difference immediately. The pencil entry was in the same handwriting, the same structure, date, name, amount, but it was lighter, tentative, the kind of mark that could be erased, reconsidered, revised, a notation in progress rather than a notation completed. The name in the pencil entry was a first name only, followed by an initial. That name and initial could not be definitively matched to any individual in the building registry during the 2015 investigation. Investigators canvassed the building. They interviewed all current residents. They cross-referenced the building's historical occupancy records going back 15 years. No exact match was found. The entry remained classified as a potential intended victim, a name written before the act rather than after, which meant something else. It meant that when Samsonova was arrested in July 2015, she may have been in the process of planning a further act. The pencil entry was potentially not a record. It was potentially a schedule. Fact: the distinction between the ink entries and the pencil entry was addressed directly in the forensic document analysis submitted to the 2017 trial. The analyst confirmed that the pencil entry was written with a different instrument, a standard graphite pencil rather than a ballpoint, and that the pressure and stroke pattern was consistent with the same author as the ink entries, but suggested a different psychological register at the time of writing. The term used was provisional notation. Dr. Grishkov's testimony on this point was among the most chilling in the trial record. The pencil entry is not an anomaly. It is, in the context of the subject's behavioral pattern, a planning document. The ink entries are completed transactions. The pencil entry is an open account. She had not decided yet, or she had decided and was waiting for the right moment. In the subject's operational logic, these two states may have been functionally identical. The name in the pencil entry has never been publicly released. The court sealed that specific detail to protect the individual who might have been the intended victim and who, presumably, is still alive and still unaware of what was written in pencil near the back of a notebook that sat on a kitchen table beside a plate of bread and sausage in a fourth-floor flat on Dimitrova Street. Someone is walking around St. Petersburg today whose name was once written in that notebook, in pencil, provisional, an open account. They do not know this. Pause. Quinopause and reality. The pencil entry generated considerable speculation about the true scope of Samsonova's intentions and the question of how many acts she had been planning that her arrest preempted. Investigators found no additional physical evidence corresponding to the pencil entry. The individual named, insofar as they could be traced, had no apparent connection to Samsonova beyond the general proximity of the neighborhood. The most cautious interpretation of the evidence is that the entry represented an intention that had not yet moved to action. The least cautious interpretation is one that this archive will not advance without evidence to support it. What the pencil entry establishes, regardless of interpretation, is that in July 2015, Tamara Samsonova was not finished. She was not finished. The arrest interrupted something. The courtyard bags and the pink water in the bathtub and the notebook on the kitchen table. These things ended the sequence, but the sequence was not complete on its own terms. The pencil entry proves that. The open account, the provisional notation, the name that no one has said aloud in public. Someone did not know on a Tuesday morning in July 2015, as they made their tea or walked their ordinary route to the market near the canal, that the sequence had stopped, that the arrest had created a gap between the pencil and the ink, that they were standing in that gap. They are still standing in it, somewhere. They just don't know where it is. The trial of Tamara Samsonova opened at the St. Petersburg City Court in January 2017. Case number 2-145-02017. She was charged with murder. The prosecution presented evidence across 17 sessions. The defense called 4 witnesses. The defendant sat at the defense table in the same careful posture she had maintained in the police interview room, hands folded, spine straight, eyes forward. She did not speak during the evidentiary proceedings. She was entitled to address the court and chose, with a consistency that the presiding judge noted in the record, not to exercise that right. She was not absent, she was watching. Her eyes moved across the courtroom with the attentiveness of a person taking inventory. The courtroom testimony of building residents, recorded in Interfax wire service transcripts, and the official court record, followed a pattern that observers noted. Witness after witness described Samsonova in terms of ordinary domesticity. They described her maintenance of the stairwell. They described the food she brought when neighbors were unwell. They described the quiet of her flat, the nodding in corridors, the small and unremarkable presence she had maintained in the building for 30 years. And then, after each description of normalcy, the prosecutor would introduce a piece of physical evidence, a photograph, a notebook entry, a numbered bag from the courtyard bins. The gap between the descriptions and the evidence was the psychological core of the trial. The prosecution's case rested on 3 confirmed victims: Sergei Pozdayev, identity confirmed by remains, an individual identified in court records only by initials in connection with the 2003 entry, and a 3rd victim confirmed through DNA evidence cross-referenced against the notebook. Additional notebook entries were presented as evidence of further acts but could not be prosecuted as individual counts due to the absence of recoverable remains or independently verifiable identification. The court record notes that investigators believed the true number of victims was higher than 3. The court was limited to prosecuting what the evidence could establish beyond the legal threshold. 3 names. The notebook contains more. 3 names. Dr. Bogdanova's appearance in the courtroom has already been addressed in this archive, but there was a second psychiatric expert called by the defense whose testimony introduced an element the media largely overlooked in favor of the more dramatic evidence. Dr. Konstantin Lebedev, a forensic psychiatrist with the State Assessment Service, testified that Samsonova's psychiatric condition at the time of the alleged acts was consistent with impaired capacity to distinguish between the moral and the practical dimensions of her actions. He did not argue that she was unaware of what she was doing. He argued that the category of wrongness, the knowledge that what she did was wrong in a way that mattered, in a way that should stop her, was not functionally accessible to her in the way it is accessible to most people. The court ultimately found her guilty. She was declared mentally ill and not subject to standard criminal sentencing. She was remanded to indefinite psychiatric detention. She received the verdict in the same posture, hands folded, spine straight, eyes forward. The disposition, psychiatric detention rather than criminal imprisonment, was challenged by some commentators as insufficient. Others argued it was the correct response to a case in which the evidence clearly established severe psychiatric illness as a primary factor. Human Rights Watch's 2016 report had already flagged concerns about conditions in Russian forensic psychiatric facilities. The question of whether the disposition constituted justice, accountability, or something else entirely is one that this archive records without resolving. What the archive records clearly is this: the building on Dimitrova Street continued to stand. Its residents continued to age. The lift continued to break each winter. The stairwell, without Samsonova, accumulated the dust of ordinary life. Justice arrived. The silence it left behind was the same silence as before. The building management company hired a cleaning service for the common areas after Samsonova's arrest. A woman from a company with a logo on the side of a van came twice a week with professional equipment. She did the work efficiently. She did not know the history of the floor she was cleaning. Some things are cleaned on the surface. The surface is never the whole story. The building registry of the residential block on Dimitrova Street in St. Petersburg's Frunzensky district is a ledger. It is kept in paper form because the building management company has not fully transitioned to digital record keeping. The pages are lined. The entries are in various handwritings corresponding to the various administrative clerks who have managed the building over the decades since its construction in 1963. Tamara Samsonova's name appears in the registry as of 1985. The entry is in a handwriting that is no longer identifiable. The clerk who made it retired in the mid-90s. Under her name, the flat number, the occupancy date, the monthly maintenance fee. For 30 years, the fee was paid without interruption. Her tenancy record shows not a single late payment. Other entries on the same pages are shorter. Several of them end with a notation in red ink that the building management used to mark a deceased occupant or a voluntary departure. Sergei Pozdeyev's entry ends this way. So does the entry for a man whose name, recorded in pencil in a different context, investigators could not fully verify. Some entries simply stop. No red notation, no forwarding address. They stop, and the line below belongs to someone else. The building registry, according to the 2016 Ministry of Internal Affairs Cold Case Review, contained 14 entries for residents who had left or ceased to appear in the building between 2003 and 2015 without formal departure notification. Of these 14, 3 were conclusively connected to confirmed victims. 5 were connected to notebook entries that could not be independently verified. The remaining 6 were assessed as likely legitimate departures, residents who moved without notifying the management company, as is common in Russian residential administration. 14 gaps in the ledger, 3 confirmed, 5 possible, 6 probably innocent. The arithmetic of this case does not resolve cleanly. What the registry reveals about the context of these events is something worth sitting with. The building was built in 1963 to house workers. It was designed for density, for efficiency, for the Soviet ideal of the collective residential unit. It was not designed for aging. It was not designed for isolation. The demographic it now housed, elderly, alone, often without close family contact in the city, was a demographic the building's architecture and administrative systems had not anticipated. The registry recorded their presence. It did not monitor it. It did not flag the gaps. The registry is a document of presence. It has no mechanism for absence. Dr. Kuznetsova's 2018 paper in the Journal of Russian Criminology addressed this structural vulnerability directly, describing what she called the administrative invisibility of isolated elderly urban residents in post-Soviet housing stock. The paper cited the Samsonova case as the most acute documented example of a systemic gap that, the paper argued, had not been substantively addressed in Russian urban housing policy by the time of publication. Myth versus reality. The Samsonova case is sometimes presented, particularly in international coverage, as a specifically Russian phenomenon, the product of Soviet-era architecture, post-Soviet administrative decay, a particular cultural tolerance for not asking questions. This framing is too comfortable. The conditions that allowed Samsonova to operate, isolated elderly people in dense urban housing, administrative systems that record presence without monitoring welfare, communities trained by proximity to practice studied non-attention, are present in urban environments across the world. The building on Dimitrova Street is particular. The conditions it created are not. The night watchman, Arkady Semyonovich Petrov, still works the same shift. This is confirmed in the court record and in subsequent reporting. He passes the courtyard bins every evening at approximately the same time he passed them on the mornings when Samsonova was carrying her bags down the stairs. He nods to the residents he passes. They nod back. The building breathes around him. He is not complicit in anything the law defines as criminal. He is complicit in something harder to name. The ordinary human preference for the explanation that requires nothing of us, the nod that continues upward. He nods. The building breathes. The registry records the names. Samsonova's name remains in the registry. Her tenancy was never formally terminated. The flat was sealed as an active investigation site and has remained sealed. In the ledger, her entry has no red notation, no departure date. The line simply continues and then stops, mid-page, where the administrative clerks decided to leave it. She is still listed as a resident. The building has not decided what to do with her. The notebook entries stop in 2015. The final entry in ink is dated April of that year. Name, amount, the usual structure. Below it, in the margin, a notation that investigators and document analysts have described as a personal symbol of unknown significance, a small mark, possibly a letter, possibly a number, possibly neither. Below the final ink entry, several pages on, is the pencil entry, the unfinished account, the open line, and below that, on the last used page of the notebook, in handwriting that document analysts confirmed as Samsonova's, but in a different register, looser, larger, written quickly or under different conditions than the other entries, is a date and a single initial, not a victim. Investigators determined this relatively quickly. The initial does not match any individual in the notebook's established pattern. It is not preceded by a monetary amount. It is not followed by a description. It is simply a date and an initial. Packed. The date in the final entry is June 28, 2015. Samsonova was arrested on July 29, 2015. The gap between the final notebook entry and her arrest is 31 days. Investigators could not establish what the date and initial referred to. The initial does not correspond to any individual in the building registry, any known associate, or any entry elsewhere in the notebook. The entry remains unresolved in the official case file. It is possible that it refers to something entirely mundane, an appointment, a debt, a personal anniversary. It is possible that it refers to something else. The question that the final entry leaves, the question this archive cannot answer and will not pretend to answer, is the question of the full count. The confirmed victims are 3. The notebook entries that could not be prosecuted are more numerous. The building registry gaps that could not be conclusively linked are more numerous still. The precise number of people whose lives ended in that 4th-floor flat or whose disappearances were facilitated by the operational structure Samsonova had built over decades remains outside any official count. The Levada Center's 2017 polling report on public attitudes toward unsolved homicides in urban Russia found that 64% of respondents believed the official count in high-profile cases was lower than the actual count. In the Samsonova case specifically, the disparity between confirmed victims and suspected victims was cited by respondents as the element of the case they found most disturbing. Not the acts themselves, the number they would never know. Dr. Grishkov, in the final passage of his behavioral analysis, addressed this directly. The archival incompleteness of this case is not an accident. It is a product of the same structural conditions that allowed the case to develop over more than a decade. The building absorbed the disappearances. The administrative systems filed the gaps. The community practiced not knowing. The result is a true count that the investigative record cannot reach. The Samsonova case will always be partially closed. That partial closure is itself a finding. It tells us something about the environment in which these acts occurred, something we need to be willing to hear. Tamara Samsonova is in a secure psychiatric facility. She receives medication. She speaks when spoken to. She is 78 years old. She is alive. The people in the notebook are not. Myth versus reality. The secure facility is not a punishment in the conventional sense. It is a containment. Whether containment constitutes justice for what the notebook records is a question that falls outside the competence of courts to resolve and inside the competence of everyone who hears this case to consider for themselves. The building still stands. The night watchman still nods. The registry still lists her name. Somewhere in the city, the person whose name was written in pencil on that final occupied page goes about their life without knowing that they once appeared in the provisional accounts of a woman who kept very careful records. The pencil mark is still there. The notebook is in an evidence file. The file is in an archive. The archive is real. Every name was a person. Every person had a life before the knock at the door, before the tea, before the blue light of the television in the corner. Sergei Pozdayev and his electrical diagrams, Pavel Rakov and his drafting pencils, Valentina Ivanova and her mushroom recipe, folded inside an address book that has not been opened since 2014. The others whose names are in the notebook and whose full identities the record could not recover. They were real. They were here. They were absorbed into the walls of a building that knew how to keep quiet. We will not let them be quiet. Conclusion. The notebook entries stop in 2015. The last line in ink is a date and a name. The last line in pencil is a date and a single initial. Investigators never located the person the initial referred to. The flat was sealed. The floral wallpaper was photographed, labeled, and filed with the physical evidence. Samsonova was moved to a secure psychiatric facility where she receives medication and speaks only when spoken to. The building's night watchman still works the same shift. He passes the bins every evening at the same time, in the same direction, without pausing. The structural conditions that allowed this case to develop over more than a decade have not been resolved by the case's resolution. The administrative invisibility of isolated elderly residents in dense urban housing is not a problem that ends with one arrest. Dr. Bogdanova's 2014 report sits in its file. The monitoring protocol that might have created a different outcome sits next to it. Its recommendation still technically active, still technically unimplemented, still technically waiting for the follow-up that will not come. What number of victims remains outside the official count? No one will say. The investigative committee's confirmed figure is 3. The notebook contains more entries than 3. The building registry contains more gaps than 3. The arithmetic does not resolve and was never designed to resolve. Some archives have a bottom, this one does not. The question left in the final entry, the date, the initial, the person walking around a city who does not know their name was once written in pencil in a spiral-bound notebook with a pattern of small blue flowers on the cover. That question will not be answered in this episode. It may not be answered at all. That is what true records look like, not tidy, not resolved, not wrapped in the clean narrative of justice served and lessons learned. True records look like a notebook on a kitchen table beside a plate of bread and a glass of tea, open to a page that tells you more than you are prepared to know, surrounded by a flat so clean it makes your eyes water. Every file in this archive is real. Every name was a person. The cold cases do not stay cold because they are forgotten. They stay cold because the systems that were supposed to warm them failed. That is the record. That is what the archive holds. Cold cases, true records, nothing buried, except the things that were already buried before anyone thought to look. Subscribe to Archive 13. Leave a comment. Which case should we open next? Every name in this archive was a person. Help us make sure they are not forgotten. Sources and references. Russian Investigative Committee, 2015. Official statement on arrest of Tamara Samsonova. Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation, Moscow. St. Petersburg City Court, 2017. Verdict transcript case number 2-145/2017. St. Petersburg City Court Archives, St. Petersburg. FBI Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, 2016. International Homicide Comparison Report, Samsonova Case Reference File, U.S. Department of Justice, Washington, D.C. Kuznetsova, E.V., 2018. Serial Murder in Post-Soviet Housing Blocks, Environmental Conditions and Administrative Failures, Journal of Russian Criminology, Volume 14, Number 2, pp. 88-112. Moscow Institute of Psychiatry, 2014. Psychiatric Evaluation Report on Tamara Samsonova, Federal Medical Research Center for Psychiatry and Narcology, Moscow. Novaya Gazeta, 2015. The Granny Who Lived Alone, Investigative Series, Anna Politkovskaya Foundation Archive, St. Petersburg Edition. Interfax, 2015. Courtroom Testimony of Building Residents, Wire Service Transcript, July-August 2015, Moscow. Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs, 2016. Cold Case Review of St. Petersburg Elderly Deaths, 2003-2015, Internal Bulletin, Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Russian Federation, Moscow. Levada Center, 2017, Public Attitudes Toward Unsolved Homicides in Urban Russia, Annual Survey Data. Levada Analytical Center, Moscow. Criminology Department, St. Petersburg State University, 2019, Analysis of Dismemberment Methods in Domestic Homicides, a longitudinal study of Russian urban cases, academic paper, St. Petersburg State University Press. Human Rights Watch, 2016, Conditions in Russian Forensic Psychiatric Facilities, Assessment of Monitoring Gaps and Detention Standards, Human Rights Watch Country Report, New York. TESS, 2015, Official Confirmation of 3 Confirmed Victims in Samsonova Case, State News Agency Release, July 31, 2015, Moscow. Bogdanova, N.A. 2016, Transactional Personality Disorder and the Architecture of Predatory Domesticity, Case Analysis, Psychiatry and Law, Volume 9, Number 1, pp's 34-51, Russian Society of Forensic Psychiatry, Moscow. Grishkov, A.M., 2018, Behavioral Analysis Report, Samsonova Case, submitted to St. Petersburg City Court, published excerpt in Journal of Forensic Behavioral Science, Volume 3, Number 4, pp. 17-29.